everybody. This is very exciting to have a monthly gathering to have this celebration of our research in the STR division. And this month, our special feature is on global strategy. I will share with you in a minute on the various events and also as an event advertisement promotion so that you will know the sequences of other events leading to our annual conference this summer. So let me go ahead and start with a sharing of some introductory slides. And you get to meet the various speakers, our panelists, and all the possible ways that you can engage in today's discussion. All right, so first of all, hello again, my name is Gwen Lee. This is our Stronger Together virtual symposia in 2022, and we are currently in April, very fast approaching towards our summer 2022 Academy Conference that will be in Seattle. If you are able to join in person, there is a hybrid mode setup. So today we're gathering together to discuss corporate and international strategy. And then later in May, we will have another virtual symposium that is on the theory of the firm and competitive advantage in ecosystems. And later in June, we will have a debate. This is a debate that we started this year as a new initiative. Earlier in February, we had a debate on when do market versus non-market strategies help firms. And then in June, we will have a debate on does a new theory of the international firm, do we need that? And that's a debate of Barney and Teese on one side versus Buckley and Verbicki on the other side. So do pay attention to these event advertisements. Please visit our STR homepage and follow us via Twitter and Instagram at AOM_STR. So for today, I would like to share with you the theme of our presentation. We have the great fortune of having current and former associate editors and co-editors of Global Strategy Journal to share with us their expertise on what they have learned in the past, and especially what they think are the most interesting developments in terms of topics and theories to analyze in the field. And the theme of the discussion will be around how should managers guide their firms to address the opportunities and challenges of operating across countries in response to the continuous transformation in the global, geopolitical, technological, and sociocultural contexts. So with that, I want to have a sequence of these clips that I have collected. So first of all, this is a gathering of celebration of the community embracing the Global Strategy Journal that is edited by Gabriel, Benito, Alvaro, Cuervo-Cazurra, and Mudambi. And this journal was launched in 2011, and the co-editors, the founding co-editors are Stephen Tallman and Torben Peterson. And the Global Strategy Journal is targeted at publishing the most influential, managerially oriented global strategy research in the world. And in 2022, this current year, we have a co-editor search. So do give us your nomination. The deadline of the nomination is May 13th, coming up very quickly. And then also, we are happy to celebrate that our current volume is number 12 in year 2022. And I just picked one of the research articles in the current issue, and that is the knowledge-based view and global strategy, past impact and future potential. The co-authors are Robert Grant and Anu Phene. Anu Phene is on the panel with us today. And also I have a little bit of advertisement to do. If you go onto Global Strategy Journal website, there is an early view of special issues, and there is a collection. It's called a primer on the topics of EMNES, stands for Emerging Market Multinational Enterprises. So I also look into Global Strategy Journal as a way to look at these collections of the articles and the conversations. So if you haven't had a chance to use that as a source of reading materials, I would highly encourage you to do that at the GSJ website. And then so today we have a great panelist with us today. The order that I'm going to introduce is the order of the presentation. First, we will have Professor Rian Drogendijk, and excuse my pronunciation, from the Netherlands. And her presentation will be followed by Steve Tallman, one of our founding co-editors, located in the United States, followed by Anu Phene, currently in India. And then Ram Mudambi will continue, followed by Dan Lee here in Indiana, United States. And Alvaro Cuervo-Cazurra will be the next speaker. And the final speaker is Gabriel Benito. So we have planned about an hour for the panelists to exchange ideas and to spark a conversation. The second half of our symposium today is driven by your participation. So please feel free to send your comments, your ideas, suggestions via the chat. I will be monitoring the chat room and help you find a way to engage. So some of the speakers, if you want to have your video shown, just to remind you that we are recording the session. But feel free to let me know. I'm more than happy to have you to directly participate and not have to go through the moderator myself. All right, so let's get the slides ready from Rian. Take it away anytime you're ready.
Yeah, thank you. I'm putting them up now. And in presentation mode, yeah.
Perfect.
So yeah, you should be able to see my slides now. Thank you for enabling me to stand here and to start this conversation on the past and future of global strategy. And my topic will be the organization of global companies. And I've been thinking about this a little bit the past few weeks and thought about a number of topics that are part of this, this domain, so to say. And I think one of these topics has its foundations in the work on the M-form organization, the large multi-business organizational form that we see in a lot of multinational companies. And secondly, related to this topic is the more hierarchical view where headquarters make strategies and subsidiaries would implement strategies that were developed by the headquarters. So this is the foundational work on this part of the organization of global companies. And I think this work evolved to also study new organizational forms. Still quite old work, but think about the network organization where subsidiaries have different kind of roles and contribute to strategy making. But I'm also thinking about more recent work on micro multinationals. So the not large companies, but still global in terms of their activities. And in this regard, also the changing hierarchies in multinationals are important. And I'm thinking, for example, about how tasks that traditionally were performed by corporate headquarters have now become dispersed throughout the global organization and are taken up by different units, sometimes subsidiaries or let's say regional headquarters or something of the kind. So future questions in this regard could be, do size and hierarchy still matter at all for global companies? And if we agree that there are different roles for subsidiaries and headquarters in the global organization, what do their roles look like in terms of how they contribute to strategy making, and what kind of new power balances do these roles entail? A second topic for me related to the organization of global companies deals with internationalization processes. And this work has its foundation in, let's say, the Uppsala model, the kind of work on a gradual expansion, starting for companies from developed markets and expanding into further and further away markets including later emerging markets. Now, this work has evolved to study also other internationalization patterns. I'm thinking, for example, about the work on born globals, where companies internationalize faster or are more or less global from the outset, or they skip at least steps in this older gradual pattern that we started out with to study in this regard. But I'm also thinking about how the growing presence of emerging market multinationals has resulted in a lot of work on how these companies show different patterns or maybe similar patterns in terms of how they gradually or less gradually expand abroad. So that is a field that has evolved from this foundational work on internationalization. And in terms of future questions, I think this domain is related to the question whether location still matters. Think about e-businesses and platform companies, for example, as the newest organizational forms in this regard. But also, how do new competitive balances between emerging market multinationals and developed market multinationals influence how they internationalize? And some could also say that perhaps for developed market multinationals, their home country gains importance because they are asked to bring certain activities home. Whereas for emerging market multinationals, the home country might be important for their internationalization strategies because their government plays a role in how they internationalize. Then a third topic for me is related and or founded in the work on the global and the multi-domestic company, where global strategies are based on standardization and multi-domestic strategies are based on adaptation to local circumstances. But all of these strategies were always based on companies growing or companies wanting to reach financial profit. And I think this kind of work has evolved to also look at new global challenges like climate change, like human rights, sustainability issues, which have made us look into the increased stakeholder pressures and more diverse stakeholder pressures that make companies look into other strategic goals. And future questions in this regard then are, what role do global companies play in solving today's great challenges? And how will they integrate these new strategic goals in their global strategy if they want to play a role in solving these challenges? And I want to share a final thought, I will make it short, which is this, that also in looking at these different questions and how our work has evolved over a long time span, I would say that this oldest work, the foundational work, very often was phenomenon driven, very often based on qualitative or case study work. And I think later on we have evolved into using more quantitative techniques to test hypotheses. I think that's quite a natural way for research. And I think also recently, or recent decades, I would say, we have improved the analytical techniques, both in terms of qualitative as well as quantitative work. I'm thinking, for example, about multi-level models that enables us to test hypotheses that also encompass more levels of analysis. But we could ask ourselves whether sometimes perhaps we have had too much emphasis on making very small contributions based on very much quantitative focused work. And I think the future questions that I have raised here, but I'm sure many of the other panelists' future questions, will require us to have this renewed focus on understanding the role of context and understanding intra-organizational processes. And that kind of work, or those kind of questions, I think require us to also embrace qualitative or at least mixed methodologies for our research. I would like to stop here.
Thank you very much, Rian. Steve, whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, let's see if I can get this to work, which I'm not doing a very good job of right at the moment. Let me see here. Share screen. Okay, so hopefully we're seeing this. My part of this discussion is about the role of cooperative strategies in international strategy, with focus on really alliances and joint ventures. At least this is what we tend to think of. In the past, I'll go through this quickly, the real focus has been on market entry alternatives and looking particularly at alliances and joint ventures as choices that are typically driven by government requirements in the distant past. And then more recently, and I date this really to Contractor and Larange's book in 1988, researchers began to look at cooperative means of market entry as a consequence of deliberate strategy, as opposed to something driven strictly by government requirements. Moving ahead from that, we began to realize that alliances came in different forms, and the differentiation between contractual alliances and equity joint ventures started to become important. And this is where we began to also see the use of different strategic perspectives. Transaction cost models, of course, Bucking and Casson, Anderson, Hennart, people like this, have been very popular and continue to be whenever we're looking at some sort of governance form. But the use of alliances and joint ventures to coordinate resource development and exploitation, not so much through fear of opportunism by a partner, but simply to improve cooperation and understanding, has come to the fore. More recently, I've been involved in some of this research, both with Anu and other people. And then I think the most recent new approach was the treatment of joint ventures or alliances as real options on markets. Bruce Kogut proposed this back in the 90s, but it's been pursued to a greater and lesser degree, where the focus is on the choice of alliance as a way of taking a look at a market and kind of developing greater understanding before deciding to make a total commitment. Where I think that this has moved today is a focus that's moved away from looking at market-driven entry into new areas. The big thing in international strategy right now is probably the tremendous increase in global value-adding networks, supply chains, various terms have been used for this. But one of the important aspects of this is that we see a tremendous amount of outsourcing. Of course, since we're talking international, we're also talking about offshore outsourcing. But and as this has developed, one of the things that I feel people who study outsourcing have, to a certain extent, neglected is that outsourcing typically involves extended contracts and other forms of long-term cooperation, which basically is what we've been studying in cooperative strategies, alliances, and joint ventures for some time. So I think that a key area of study right now is bringing together the work on alliances, joint ventures, and cooperative strategies with the studies of outsourcing. And I think this is also quite relevant to the companies that are using this. Another area that's becoming more and more important are strategies in the sharing economy, the gig economy, the platform economy, whatever we want to call it, which involve a lot of cooperative strategies. The platforms, particularly the multinationals, but the actual service providers and the customers, when they work with the platform, we're typically working in some sort of cooperative fashion. So I think that there's a lot of room to use alliance ideas to develop this. And then finally, knowledge sharing seems to be deeply involved with international cooperative strategies. In fact, many of us think this is really what drives much cooperation is the search for knowledge that's not currently available within the firm and requires some sort of external access. And then looking to the future, and all three of those ideas are things that are subject to study now, but clearly have a long way to go before we have conclusive thoughts. As we look to the future, I think that this changing global business environment that Gwen described really is going to make cooperative strategies seem more important. The current geopolitical strains that we see around the world suggest that local identity is going to be very important to companies taking part in these somewhat newly isolationist markets. If we want to continue to take advantage, though, of international networks, scale, economies, global brands, and all of this sort of thing, I think that this may turn out to be more easily done through cooperation rather than through whole ownership. The same thing with the platform-driven two-sided markets that I discussed. And then I think that the whole issue of climate change, and we see pandemics and other natural disasters or natural disasters enhanced by human mistakes, suggests the need for organizational slack and redundancies in our supply chains and in our distribution chains, which, if handled through vertical integration, will be very expensive and very limiting. And this will also reduce flexibility a lot. So again, I think that cooperative strategies and alliance type organizations are going to become much more important in dealing with this kind of rapidly changing environment. Another key point, I believe, is that the development of information tech, which obviously is just increasing at a remarkable rate. I think this reduces the value of ownership. One, in this idea of guarding against opportunism through what's been called mutual hostages, and two, in the idea of expediting shared tacit knowledge, which has always been tied a lot to face-to-face discussions. I think that we'll find that combination of information technology and relational management concepts that do not necessarily involve ownership are going to become more and more important in cooperative arrangements. So I guess what I expect to see, and what I hope that some of you all will be able to research over the coming decades, is that we'll probably see more cooperative networks and probably less cross-border capital investment and more flexibility. And I would kind of summarize this by suggesting that I would expect to see more cooperation, but less equity use of equity joint ventures. And on that note, I will check off.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. And Anu, anytime you're ready. Perfect.
Okay, thanks very much, Gwen. And I'm glad to be on this panel with a lot of people that I've worked with as collaborators, but also, at GSJ. And interestingly, I know Gwen highlighted this, but when Alvaro asked if I'd be on the panel, we just did a paper for Global Strategy Journal on the knowledge-based view, and it was called Past Impact and Future Potential in terms of the intersection of knowledge-based view and global strategy. So I'm going to heavily draw on that in my presentation, particularly in terms of the past and the evolution. And then for the future, I've got a compilation of areas that I will draw. So, when I think about sort of these boundaries of knowledge and global strategy, I think about the foundations of this literature, right? And you can see there was a real emphasis on the role of organization-specific knowledge in enabling expansion in the global arena. So we can think about a lot of the foundational work here. So for example, you think of Heimer's early work, right? Which talked about firm-specific advantages, including knowledge. So things like managerial skills and technology in enabling foreign direct investment, allowing firms to go overseas. You could also think about Cave's work, when he talked about the multinational enterprise's ability to deploy knowledge overseas without having to incur the sunk costs associated with developing that knowledge in the first place all over again. I know Steve talked about sort of the internalizing argument, and you can think about that in the context of the international arena, where Buckley and Casson talked about the benefits of internalizing knowledge transactions within the multinational enterprise. You can also think about knowledge and learning in that overseas context. You can sort of see a shift here in terms of, from the organization specific knowledge, it starts to incorporate more of the global elements of knowledge. So learning about a specific country and how that might fuel better expansion later on, like Johansson and Valney's work did. And you can see that emphasis in the eclectic paradigm too, right? When Dunning talks about certainly ownership advantages that echo some of the things that I've talked about, but the location advantages in terms of the knowledge benefits that countries might offer. So you can see what happens then in terms of the evolution from this, the foundation that was created for knowledge, where there's a real interest in looking at not just how the firm uses this knowledge to go overseas, but how does it really create an organizational capability for the multinational enterprise. And very central to that is the last 2 points that I had about the spatial elements of knowledge. So the location elements that sort of come to the forefront. So here I think about, for example, a lot of John Dunning's work on technological competence of the multinational that comes as a result of the dispersed locations where there is access to all this knowledge. I think also about, this idea of capability that comes from knowledge and the ability not just to source, but exchange. Kogut and Zander's foundational work on the firm as a social community that enables these exchanges. There's a lot of work then that shifted the focus down to the subsidiary level, right? Including Ram's work there with John, some of my work on subsidiary capabilities that really came from their connectedness to that host country, and from that learning that was then leveraged for the benefit of the multinational enterprise. And then again, you can see the location element explored separately, where there's a lot of work on the value of sourcing knowledge from different geographic regions because of the benefits it confers. For example, in some of the work that I've done in terms of breakthrough innovations, and also the challenges to accessing some of this spatially dispersed knowledge. So Steve and I, for example, have done some work here where we sort of looked into trying to unpack some of the characteristics of knowledge that would, prevent it from being much more mobile across geographic boundaries. So I guess I want to spend the most time on the future, right? How can we think about exciting opportunities that exist in terms of thinking about knowledge and global strategy, right? So I think foundationally, we have to change our view on how we've thought about knowledge. So I think in the past, we thought about knowledge as something that firms protect, right? And I think if you look at a lot of the literature, for example, if you look at Oliver Alexi's work on disclosures, there's a shift in thinking on how you can wield knowledge in the global arena for strategic objectives, right? So what do these disclosures do? So some of the ongoing work, for example, that I'm interested in is how can firms use their knowledge to really signal something to someone else, right? So with Steve, we are looking at how can you do it for alliances, to create better alliances, to draw the right kind of partner and to enable that selection. With another co-author, we are looking at these disclosures in terms of rivals sort of following your technological trajectory, and when that signpost is used by a rival and when is it seen as something that might dissuade them from pursuing that technological trajectory. So I think foundationally, what is interesting to me is the shift in thinking about knowledge as something to be protected versus something that you can disclose for your benefit. The second element that I see as really interesting is, when Rob and I wrote that paper, we talked about how there's perceptions of knowledge as objective. And I confess that I've always looked as knowledge is very objective because I've looked at patent data, right? And there you can see there's information that's coded that can be used. But there's a social constructionist view of knowledge that suggests that even the information in patent documents may be interpreted in different ways. And here I think, the international arena offers a lot of interesting opportunities for looking at how context might shape how you perceive this knowledge and how you process this knowledge. So here I think there's lots of neat work in the investor psychology literature, for example, by Dan Kamen, who's looked at, how attention to different information varies, how there are biases and heuristics that you rely on, such as expert assessments or biases towards recency. So I think there's opportunities to look at these information processing ideas associated with the organization and the individual that influence our knowledge use. You see that I have an image of a chessboard there. And so if you go back to the work of Simon, there's some interesting work on reasoning processes, right? And in that, he talks about how chess grandmasters use a chunking process where they rely on chunks of information that put together, past patterns that they can deploy effectively in a game to really think about what moves their opponent might make. And so I think there's potential for us to really apply that in the context of the firm. The last point is really this idea of a multi-level knowledge process, right? So we've talked a little bit in the past about the firm and the subsidiary, but I think there's real opportunity here to look at the interaction. So some of the work that I think is interesting, something that Grazia and I worked on recently, looked at how an individual and a unit may interact to influence a multinational knowledge sourcing. So I think, again, there are opportunities there that we can really pursue to explore this area. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu. Then we have Ram. And I'm going to ask Ram to unmute. Okay. Yes, we can hear you now. Perfect.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll get this eventually. Get this right. Thank you so much, Gwen and Heather, for putting this together and inviting me with a number of very good friends and colleagues. I'm very excited to share my thoughts on global strategy, looking back and looking forward. Just a quick overview of my own interests stem from examining the role of economic geography on innovation processes, and that sort of informs my view of strategy, and that's what I'm going to try and look at today. The way I'm going to look at this is, rather than pointing to specific articles and specific work like Steve did so masterfully, I'm going to adopt a very approach that John Maynard Keynes used when he wrote his general theory back in the 30s, where he chunked the entire 19th century together as the past. So I'm going to talk about the entire 20th century and say basically going forward where we are. Now, the business environment has changed drastically, in my opinion. And again, this is sort of looking at the geography/innovation view of this. Coordinating business over geographic distance in the 20th century was very costly. And today, in the 21st century, we're looking at a situation where it is nearly costless. I mean, in the GSJ, we had a special issue last year. We talked about digitalization, for example, and all these tools are mechanisms. Steve alluded to these as well, and Anu did as well, so did Rian, that ultimately these tools are going to have made dramatic changes in the coordination of business. That is going to have, that creates a lot of opportunities for managers that we can study. In the 20th century, production capabilities were critical. Clearly, especially the high age of the 20th century, mass production, big factories. These were basically the hallmarks of wealthy countries. When we go to the 21st century, this is really not the case. Innovation capabilities are critical, and we're finding increasingly that these big mass production units are actually things that are not in advanced economies. They tend to actually be in poorer economies. And connected to that very closely, value is based in the 20th century on mass-produced tangibles. We basically made, one black card. We said sold it to everybody. In the 21st century, on the other hand, we have value creation is based on customized, knowledge-based intangibles. So things that you cannot see, touch, and feel are where all the value comes from. And this is a dramatic change in the environment. And finally, the international business in the 20th century was focused on geopolitical allies. So we looked at, for example, the US and Western Europe, or the US and Japan. That's where all the business was done. Mostly international business was between allies. And international politics forced on rivals. So basically the US and the USSR, not much business there. It was all about missiles and military and politics. On the other hand, in the 21st century, international business and international politics are inextricably linked. We are now in a world where the US and China are major geopolitical rivals of the 21st century, as pointed out by, for example, people like David Teese. But they're also inextricably linked in terms of economics. And now, of course, we're looking forward. Again, I'll say a few words about this as well. Whether going forward in the next decade, next 2 decades, are we going to see a decoupling between the US and China? In other words, is this period of linkage, is this sort of a period of temporary, or is it something that we're going to see permanently? Now, these changes in the environment have necessitated changes in global strategy. Managers need to react to these changes. And this, in my view, has led to 3 global strategy megatrends. First of all, as Steve pointed out this, and Rian pointed out this as well, the strategic dispersal of the M&E value-creating activities, GVC, global, to different locations. There's a shift from trade and goods, where you made an entire good in a location, to actually very, very increasingly narrow activities, which are done in locations incredibly in micro geographic locations. So cities and the areas of cities are becoming increasingly important and connected to each other. This leads to some questions, as Steve alluded to, about how much does this affect resilience? Because we had this highly finely tuned machine of a global economy based upon connectivity between all these different nodes. But when there's a disruption, then we get a tremendous cascading effect all around the world. And is this going to lead to a change? How do managers react to this? Do they give up all the benefits of specialization, super specialization that we have seen, or and go backwards, or do they work out different means of redundancy that Steve mentioned? The control of knowledge-intensive intangibles, of course, is the key source. Ultimately, what do firms do? Again, connected to what Steve said, firms can get rid of low value creating activities that focus increasingly on where value is. Value is the intangibles, that's what you want to keep control about. And therefore, you don't need to own, you don't need to control lots and lots of tangibles. There's a rapid migration of value away from those tangibles, and you can give them away to other firms without too much worry. And finally, of course, firms need to engage. Multinational M&Es need to engage with EM&Es. Gwen pointed out this in her opening remarks, the EM&Es. So these Western, Japanese, advanced country multinationals need to focus on these EM&Es as collaborators, specializing in complementary activity. They just think about strategic questions arising for that. As competitors in global markets, because many of these EM&Es are also rapidly catching up and competing as well. And of course, both of these concerns are subject to geopolitical realities. But for example, we have Western government bans on some Chinese firms like Huawei. And this, of course, is going to have cascading effects on all the managerial decisions as to who do you work, who are your partners, because you're going to be impinged if your partners are banned from large contracts. That's going to affect your business. So you need to factor that into your global strategy. Okay, so I'm going to stop here to basically exhort the junior scholars in the audience to say that the future is incredible. You have enormous opportunities for research. I look forward to seeing the work that you do.
Beautiful. Next, we have Dan.
All right, thank you, Ben. Let me share my screen here. Yeah.
Yes, I can see it very well.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you for having me here for this very interesting discussion. It's great to see some old friends and some new names as well. I think Ram's talk, transitioned us very smoothly from our discussion on the, the knowledge part, the cooperation part, the organization part, to the context of international business of global strategy. So I'm going to spend a few minutes to talk about institutions, the institutional environment. So for the past 20, 30 years, we have seen the blossom of research on institutional environment, mainly about how the institutional environment would impact firm strategies and activities. So if we look into the literature, the foundational work, two names that are cited most, probably. One is North's work about the, defining institutions, and also Scott 1995, both are very frequently cited in research in global strategy when it comes to institutions. Now, of course, Scott's book about institutions, that was cited over 20,000 times. And now it's also won the Nobel Memorial Prize for his work on institutions. So when we talk about institutions, we're talking about the rules of the game in a society, to cite North's definition. We have, our field, has accumulated knowledge about the definition of institutions, what they are, the specific dimensions, depending on the theoretical perspective, whether we're talking about organizational institutionalism, or we're talking about institutional economics. We have different ways to look at the dimensions of institutions. We're talking based on Scott, we have the regulative, the cognitive, the normative pillars. Based on the theme of North's work, we have the formal, informal institutions. And very often we are talking about the institutional distance. Tatiana Kostova did a lot of work there, and has been very widely studied as well. So over the past 20 years or so, institutional distance, as you can see the figures, the small figures I put at the bottom. So we have seen a very fast development in terms of our understanding of the institutional environment. Now, one is about institutional complexity. So we have recognized that institutions are at different levels. Actually, even in those original work, this has been acknowledged, but it's just empirical work that has not really followed up, caught up timely. We have also recognized the local level institutions, for large countries like China and India. Of course, institutions can vary dramatically within a country, but even for small countries like Vietnam, we could see institutional variation across countries, within the country. So the subnational heterogeneity has been recognized and studied. The next part, under the institutional complexity subtitle, as you can see on the screen, is institutional polycentrism. The person who, Eleanor Ostrom, I just have to mention her name. She's a Nobel Prize winner, and she was a faculty member here at Indiana University. I have to mention her name not just because she's from Indiana, also because of her work there. In her work, and also after she won the Nobel Prize, she wrote an article for American Economics Review talking about the polycentric governance for complex economic system. So basically discussing the rule-setting entities are actually spread out throughout the society, different dimensions, the complexity of institutions. So in our management literature, we started to see the discussion about institutional complexity, institutional polycentrism. Like the work by Beth Gagel and Michael Hitt and Toya Miller, several of my co-authors, started to look at the multiplicity and the substitution across different institutional dimensions. So when we talk about these dimensions, very naturally, we are going to discuss the influence, the interaction, and also the influence across these different institutional dimensions. So in terms of the institutional dynamism, we have started our work along two lines or two themes. One is the overall evolution of institutions. This theme of research is very much on emerging economies, as several of our speakers have already mentioned. Talking about the stages and processes of pro-market reform. Very often, that's what we're talking about. And we have a lot of discussion about institutional void, how that would influence not only multinational firms' investment in those environments, but also how firms from those countries escape that environment, to internationalize. So we're talking about institutional impact from both home and host countries. So that's what we've seen so far. The other theme of the dynamics of institutional environment is the internal dynamics across different dimensions. This theme actually is still quite thin. I have a paper talking about the micro mechanisms, how entrepreneurs, how individuals could take advantage of the changes in the formal institution and then push for evolution in the informal institutional part. But very few studies still in that area. On the screen, I put the firm strategies from activities that have been studied under the influence of institutional environment. My colleagues have already discussed a lot of that. I won't go into the details. So in terms of the future research, what we can see here, one is to continue our study on complexity and dynamism. For formal versus informal institutions, we have spent a lot of attention on formal because, well, we can observe them, they're written, right? We can observe them, we can measure them, we can compare them. But at the same time, for informal institutions, it's hard to theorize and also it's hard to measure. And very often we just equal informal institution as cultural distance. We really need to move beyond that and also look at institutions as portfolios, as profiles, rather than simply as distance. I'm not saying this to undervalue the contribution of institutional distance. That's a very well established construct in the field. And it has and it will continue to contribute to our understanding about how the environment would influence a variety of business activities. Actually, I included a figure here. This is a special issue by GSJ that several colleagues of mine and I did together. That was the last issue of 2021, I believe. And here, as you can see, we have many well understood institutional components, how that would influence a diversity of entrepreneurship activities, entrepreneurship related activities from individuals, up to the, all types of issues related to this. Okay, let me come back to here. Now, the next one, of course, is something that all the previous speakers have touched upon, is about the digital, the platform. And Rian also mentioned, whether location still matters. Very interesting, although on surface, it may seem like everything is digital, you can go anywhere, do anything. But at the same time, we do have the digital protectionism. When it comes to competition, we're talking about liability of foreigners, at the same time, liability of outsidership, right? Particularly if we're talking about e-businesses based on ecosystem, like Alibaba, like Amazon. Alibaba, sometimes it's probably a little bit exaggeration, but almost single-handedly established the logistics system in China and also the credit system in China. So their role, the co-evolution between businesses and institutions, that part is something that we need to pay more attention to. And we're seeing faster and faster interaction between these two, but it's also very difficult. Well, that's something we need to work on in terms of how we theorize co-evolution, how we measure co-evolution. So these are really important topics. The other two I just mentioned very briefly. One is institutional disruption. With the pandemic that we are still in today, with terrorism, these are very violent events happening, the war, how all of this would impact institutions, it would disrupt the institutions where businesses operate, and how they respond to it. How do companies exit? The timing of their decisions. I am working on a literature review on violence conflict with a colleague of mine. And this is very much fragmented. We can borrow a lot of insights from other disciplines, for interdisciplinary work, to better understand the disruption of institutions. The last one is about the human element. Anu also mentioned the social constructionist view. Yes, we make decisions. Humans make decisions. So the heterogeneity in terms of people's understanding, executives' understanding, and sense-making of institutions, of institutional evolution, that's what drives the decision-making part. So we really need to pay more attention to the micro foundation of strategic decision-making in this context. But of course, we human, we bear the consequences of any strategic decisions made by multinational firms. So that's the part, for example, I put CSR, CSIR, irresponsible behavior. Where do you allocate? Where do you transfer those not so advanced technology that may create, let's say, environmental pollution, right? Institutional environment, the formal regulation definitely matters, but the individual level, like a paper I'm working with my co-authors, which is about, well, do you want to pollute your home country? Right? As the executive, there will be some decision to make. Well, I think I'm going to stop here. I've taken too much time. Well, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Dawn. This is excellent. And you have introduced to our younger audience one of my intellectual heroes. So I put the wiki link to Professor Eleanor Armstrong. Feel free to tap on it. Okay, next we have Alvaro. Take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Gwen, for organizing this. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and thank you, the strategy division, for organizing the series of events. I think this is great. And thank you all my friends at USJ for joining me here. What I'm going to do is build on what Dan has introduced, which is the notion of institutions, and then take it further with, if you want, an idea, which is the evolution of the role of the government. So let me take you in a little tour. Kind of once upon a time, and this is kind of where we started institutions and global strategy. And this is what mostly Dan has explained very well. The idea here, the government plays, if you want, an indirect role in influencing global strategy. It was a story of the government in the background, in which, yes, institutions, both formal institutions, the one rules, regulations, laws, and then informal, and there I will just add the importance of culture. We're driving how we understood global strategy, and the idea that managers will basically think about differences across countries, and then select countries that were closer in psychic distance, and then select entry modes that were easier to use in order to transfer sorry, the knowledge, the resources they had. The idea here was the government provided, to some extent, or the influence of the government on the context, created constraints on the ability of companies to enter. It was literally the argument coming from mostly work from the World Bank with the idea, and especially economists, the idea that good pro-market institutions are fantastic for countries, and therefore governments should try to promote this, and that led to the deregulation, the liberalization of countries. We're talking about the 1990s, 1980s, and that was the beginning of what we now call the golden era of globalization. So here the government is kind of in the background, is yes, provide nice institutions, support market transactions, and companies are going to do very well. From there, it seems, in my opinion, that we have evolved into a slightly different story when we started analyzing emerging markets. And there the idea was, yes, this is nice. Why emerging markets? They are interesting. They are joining, if you want, global business. They are becoming really good places to do business, not only because they have low-cost factors of production, mostly the story of why don't you go to an emerging market? Look, you can exploit lots of low-cost labor, you can exploit natural resources, you can take advantage of those location conditions. But also, all of a sudden, these are countries that start to grow and they become, to some extent, interesting places to start investing, to sell there. And here it's kind of, look, this is fantastic. What about the role of the government? So here it was kind of a tricky situation in which, on the one hand, governments were trying to attract the foreign investments. On the other hand, the institutions, the rules, norms of regulation, the existence of corruption, the existence of what in many cases were non-democratic systems in which managers were not really used to operating, started to add some challenges to operations. So all of a sudden, the government takes a much more active role in determining what companies can do. And here we end up with, if you want, a divergence of arguments and theories in terms of, yes, the context is going to help. And because in some cases the context is so difficult, some companies are going to out-innovate others, the frugal innovation story, which then became the reverse innovation. And on the other hand, this is a really difficult context to operate. So now we have the idea of escape internationalization, in which some of the companies, domestic companies, decide that, look, I'd rather go to other places in which I have more supportive governments and let me just invest abroad. So we have an evolution from the government as a background in which they are just providing support for institutions to the government acting in a dual role. Yes, on the one hand, is going to be a supportive government. On the other hand, in some cases, they can't really do much support and companies start internationalizing in different ways. And then to some extent, we have rediscovered the importance of governments. And this is what I call a political global strategy, in which now governments do play a much more active role. We understand governments as a key determinants of the strategy of companies, in many cases influenced by our understanding of emerging markets, but also now partly influenced by what happened throughout the recent crisis, in which governments, both in emerging and advanced economies, took a much more active role, which was not expected from the idea that governments should be background and just provide supporting institutions, and it started helping companies go through the crisis and in some cases internationalize. So now we have a much more direct influence of the government on the global strategy of companies, directly through subsidies, in many cases diplomatic support. You go together with the government and meet the president of the country, and you have these delegations with managers that can meet presidents, and that facilitates investments. And now we have the discussion of state-owned multinationals, which Gabriel is going to go in much more detail. And here the idea is now all of a sudden the government can be a source of advantage. It's not just background, but it's directly going to help in some cases companies internationalize. In some cases, it's going to be indirectly through support at home, subsidies, push towards innovation, which is ideas that Anu and Ram were discussing before, in which all of a sudden we have a new role for the government in global strategy, a much more active actor, and not only through state-owned companies, which they own, but also helping private companies go abroad. So in a sense, and this is, if you want, the idea I'd like everybody to remember, to some extent, and there is this big evolution in the strategy on the role of government and how we understand governments, starting with institutions, background, and this is something that is going to support companies with the role of differences across countries, There is also the informal institutions in terms of culture towards, well, it might have a dual influence here. In some cases, it's going to be supportive. In other cases, it's going to be a problem because it doesn't work well. And now towards a much more direct influence of the government on global strategy and how companies compete on a global basis because they have the help of governments. And that's it. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Alvaro. All right, Gabriel, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Take it home for us.
Yep, let me see. Okay, are my slides up?
Perfect.
Okay, good, thank you. And thank you for organizing this. And in many ways, it's always very nice to be sort of the last presenter, because I'm truly standing on very solid shoulders, and you know, all I need to do is fill in some gaps, and the particular gap I'm going to fill in was briefly introduced by Alvaro, and that is state-owned enterprises. And in many ways, this is a tale of, it's a matter of two tales of multinational enterprises. Now, state-owned companies have been around for quite some time, centuries in fact, but not many of them were multinationals. But over the last century, we saw an increasing number of state-owned multinational companies. In other words, companies that operate in more than one country. And if you take a good look back in history, there were really sort of two types of state-owned companies that were multinationals. In the West, there were mainly large, inefficient dinosaurs that were there in order to secure national interests, to provide employment, perhaps to take care of some regional issues in the country. And basically they were there because private enterprise were not interested in doing those activities. Elsewhere in the world, they were virtually non-existent, apart from perhaps some national resource state-owned multinationals. It's not that there were no state-owned companies, it was just that they were not multinationals, or very few of them. The perspective on multinationals back then, that means throughout the 70s and well into the 80s and early 1990s, was that these companies were really due to misguided policies, protectionistic policies, ideology that favored collective ownership and particularly state ownership, and or that at best they were sort of second best solutions to solve a range of more political rather than economic goals. And most of the time, at least scholars that were interested in business and economics were really not very interested in looking at these companies, because they could not be explained through their models. I think Alan Rugman, one of the founding fathers of internalization theory, I think at some point called them purely political animals. So there was sort of they were not aligned with the way that we typically thought in international business and in global strategy research. But that changed, and that changed throughout the 80s and towards what became sort of the end of history, as Fukuyama put it. In the 1990s, in the West, you saw a wave of privatization and then also the emergence of a new type of state-owned companies, so-called hybrids, that were partially owned by the state, but also partly privately owned. They were listed on stock companies, and those companies were different. They worked differently. They looked differently. They had different goals than their ancestors. And these hybrid state-owned multinationals, those that came from the West, largely seem to behave similarly to private ones. Actually, some of them even thrived on the opportunity to internationalize and gained learning effects from that. So growing out of their home countries was good for them, because they picked up new competences and also exposed to the disciplinary effects of meeting competition. So that was good for those companies. You had a parallel tale in but different one in the large emerging markets and in emerging countries generally, and that is of the emergence of emerging market multinationals with very large pockets, with a certain appetite for taking risk and for growing quite rapidly through strategic acquisitions in the West. And these companies were a different breed, and their behavior much more aligned with home country goals and the particular institutional context that they came from. But and that also resulted in other ways of doing things. If they were not sort of mimicking the strategies of Western multinational companies, like their brothers and sisters state-owned companies were doing in those countries, but rather pursuing other types of strategies. For example, much more interested in engaging in joint ventures to secure legitimacy wherever they went. Now, looking forward, state-owned multinationals are and will be all over the place. They no longer serve the exception, but rather there will be just many firms among a even larger pool of firms. And in the West, we also see or likely see the reemergence of state-owned multinationals that are not just hybrid state-owned multinationals that have some state ownership but otherwise behave just like multinational companies, but that are markedly different because they take on domestic interests, national interests much more seriously. This is partly driven by a new geopolitical situation that, for example, again, ask the question of whether national interests, or for that matter, resilience, security, and so forth, is more important or equally important as efficiency considerations moving forward. Now, the way that we are going to understand these companies require a different approach than so far. And I think that you'll see that research is going to be rather eclectic, at least initially, with blended frameworks with some economic factors in them, some political factors in them, and some institutional factors in them, in order to sort out what type of behaviors we could expect from these state-owned multinationals. there will be an increased interest in the different contexts, both home countries and host country contexts. There will be a much more advanced and nuanced discussion of the goals that these companies have, not just financial, but also socioeconomic goals, political goals, industry policy goals, and etc. So all in all, a very fertile ground for new research. So just start digging on it. And with that, I'll stop and open up for a more general discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. All right, so now we have scheduled enough time to have two forms of engagement. One is to have your Q&A. I have collected 3 from the chat, but if you want to continue to put them in there, because the second form would be a breakout room. We're going to simulate more kind of like meet the editors type of environment, and I will randomly break people into smaller groups so you can have more direct interaction. The 3 questions that I've collected, I'm going to ask the person who raised the question, because you may need some back and forth clarification so that you know exactly what you're posing to the panelists, and panelists can get a better understanding of what the essence of the question is. So first, I'm going to ask Bruce Kibler, would you like to turn on your camera and ask your question? Is Bruce still here? Okay, I'm looking for the participant list. Okay, well, I am going to read that question from the chat. So panelists, be ready. You can interpret the question more of your style. This comes from a discussion where I was just thinking in general, right? So in June, we're going to have this debate, and I would like to get these panelists a first look at this question. Do we need a new theory of the quote unquote international firm? And Bruce responded, oh, not just a new theory, but a new basis of economic thought and economic development, which is more holistic and real in its nature? Question mark. So panelists, do we need a new theory?
Shall I give it a start?
Absolutely, Rian.
And I will warn you, I'm going to be nuanced, which is maybe boring, but the safe way to go, maybe. So I'm on the fence a little bit, right? So I think we do not need a new theory for all global companies or for all global strategic activity, because some, maybe even much of this can still be explained with the models we have, maybe with smaller adaptations to the models we already have. But maybe for some observations or for some phenomena, we might need real contextualizations and therefore more drastically reformed or reworked theories. And maybe if I understand the comment of Bruce correctly, so if he says a complete new economic reality, right? Then I'm thinking maybe part of this idea for, our need for new theory is related to that companies don't only have financial or growth related goals. So if indeed we require from companies that they play a role in geopolitical reality of today or in the global challenges and climate change issues, etc., then maybe for those kind of goals, we do need new theories. So that's my first reaction on that.
All right, a nuanced look. Yes,
I think
Ron?
one of the problems here is very often the word theory is bandied about rather loosely. I think there's a lot of confusion about what's a theory and what's a model and what's a, the different aspect, what's a hypothesis. There are different levels of looking at this. I think obviously we don't need a new theory because we've had the idea of cross-institutional competition for since the beginning of time. Institutions have always competed with each other. The joint stock company is not something that was God-given or created out of some government fiat, but it's something that competed. I mean, in the 19th century, we had numerous different forms of business organization, and by the 20th century, the joint stock company emerged as the victor, as the most successful of the organizational arrangements in terms of dealing with risk and value creation. As we go forward, obviously, the world is changing, technology is changing, geopolitical rivalries are changing. But at the end of the day, the reality, the theoretical lens of institutional competition, as put forward by people like North, will continue. So there's really no need for a new theory. Empirical realities, geopolitical realities will change. And that's going to lead to different outcomes. We'll see different outcomes. That doesn't mean we have different theories, it's simply different outcomes, which come out of fundamentally the same theoretical framework.
Thank you, Ram. Any more perspectives you would like to chime in? Gabriel, I see you raise your hand.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, given that together with Irina Surdu and Henry Greve, last year, we got an article out in JIPS called Back to Basics, which is simply a call for taking the theories that they already have much more seriously and actually use them, and rather than sort of jumping from one theory to the other, just because we encounter new contexts and the contexts that we already know are slightly changing. Now it is absurd, the idea that that everything needs to be understood and described in detail at all times. Now that's not the purpose of theory. Theory is supposed to be fairly general, fairly universal, and also withstand the time as such. So I line up with Ram here that we don't really need necessarily so much of new theory, given sort of a proper definition of what the theory is. We may, of course, want to have and be open for various types of frameworks and models to get a good grip of things. But let's develop and fine tune the theories that we already have, and rather than ditch them. Generally, I would urge, particularly you young scholars out there, to do.
Okie doke. I'm going to put that reference to the Back to Basics in JIPS in the chat, just a moment. Do we have one more comment? And I'll move to John Dilliard. I see John is still in the virtual room. Oh, two more hands? Okay, Alvaro and Anu. Oh, sorry. So John, get your question ready. Alvaro, please.
Thank you. One way to understand this is, do we need new theories? It depends who you ask. If you already developed a theory, of course, you are going to say, no, we don't need new theories. My theory is good enough. If you have not developed your theory, you want to make a contribution, I need a new theory. If you have been in the field long enough, you realize a good theory explains a lot. What we may need is variations and the sophistication and introduction of new arguments that relax some of the assumptions rather than a completely new theory. And then that goes with the comment of what is theory, and there I will separate theory with capital T and theory with lowercase. Capital T theories explain the behavior of companies in general. And for those, we have very few of them. Lowercase theories are pretty much explanations of behavior. We call them models in other occasions. And for those, we have lots of them. And of course, if you want to make a contribution to the literature, we usually expect you to do some new variation on the model. And yes, call it, if you want theory, I will call it theory with a lowercase.
Thank you, Alvaro. So Anu and then Dan.
Okay, so I agree with what Gabe was saying about, theories are much broader. and you can think about how you extend them. I liked Alvaro's point about relaxing assumptions. When Rob and I were talking about the knowledge-based view, we debated a lot about whether it is relevant anymore. And for example, one of the things we talked about is how can it factor in AI if the firm uses AI rather than individuals to really create knowledge, right? And it would mean relaxing some of the assumptions that are there in the KBV, like Alvaro talks about, but I don't think it necessarily means creating an entirely new theory. And I know I'm not talking about the firm per se, but I'm trying to subscribe it within those boundaries of knowledge. So I think there's definitely extensions, there's amendments, but I don't know if there's a new theory that's needed.
Okay, Ben?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I agree with what my colleagues just shared. At the same time, since Bruce is not here, so I just want to take the liberty of interpreting the question. But one thing is, I think that's a very worthwhile question to raise. And I think this type of question needs to be raised at different points, particularly when we have a very, very rapidly evolving phenomenon in front of our eyes. So I think that's a very worthwhile, although our answers could maybe a bit different there. At the same time, in terms of broadening, to broaden this question a bit, I don't know what Bruce is talking about. Not only just theory, just in terms of the theme of research, for example, entry mode. We're talking about this, those different types of entry modes in the context of where we are today with digital business. We do need to take another look at the entry modes. Does this still make sense, to use that to study the I-businesses or E-businesses today? That's the question mark. But when it comes to the theories, the causal relationship that the literature has put in place, yeah, I agree with my colleagues. We need to look at that first to see how we relax assumptions, whether we can still enrich our theories before rushing to, let's say, we have a new one there.
All right. Okay, so John Billiard, would you like to ask your question?
Gwen,
Yes.
I think Steve has something to add. And
sorry. Go ahead.
All right, it's hard not to weigh in on something as broad as do we need a new theory. One thing that occurs to me is that speaking to the strategy division, that I think that some of the questions that were raised could go back to what I see as the predecessor in a way of international business and international strategy, which is economic theory, to pick on Ram a little bit. But I think that the idea of abstracting international economics, trade theory, foreign direct investment completely from the rest of the world has come close to reaching the end of its usefulness, at least as predicting what firms might do under any given circumstance. So classic comparative advantage or neoclassical models are just this idea that good economic models are abstract and they work within themselves and then get applied in general to the world. I think that we're really, they're losing a lot of power to predict what's going to happen. On the other hand, I think that this is really one of the reasons why strategy has been successful, is that strategy largely comes out of economics of various sorts, but bringing in industrial or organizational economics, and then it is incorporated behavioral issues, institutional issues, and so forth. So I think that actually there are, as people have said, a lot of theoretical perspectives, whether grand theory or just conceptual models of what firms do and why they might do it within the strategy realm. And I think that these can be amended and modified and perhaps brought together. So instead of looking at them as alternatives to one another, we start looking at them as the smaller conceptual models as different views of the elephant, and we start trying to incorporate them together. I back in the 90s tried to incorporate transaction cost economics and resource-based model, but you go way beyond that today. So I would say, I think pure economics needs to start thinking that that's being pure is perhaps not as useful as it could be. But I think strategy as sort of an inherently open discipline has a lot of models, and working with what we have and combining and recombining them, I think is leaves a lot of options for new scholars.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so next question. John Gilliard, would you like to ask your question? Thank you for showing the video.
Yes, thank you. I didn't anticipate having to be on camera, so I'm in Zoom dress, and I apologize for that. But this is something I've been thinking about lately, realizing that we're woefully behind Agenda 2030. Not enough action has been taken at the government level, and the damage to the climate continues at a steady pace. But at the same time, we're seeing more and more companies, especially global firms, realizing that it's to their best advantage to try to do something about about climate change and about addressing the SDGs, and are actively engaging in those actions and activities. So it got me to wonder, what role can global firms really play in this? And are they capable of filling what is essentially a different form of institutional void? You know, it's a backwards institutional void. I guess that's not one. It's been created by governments. So it's not. I guess it is the same kind of institutional void that that companies could maybe take advantage of, but for a good social and environmental good. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
All right, so panelists, climate change.
Well, let me take a quick shot at that. There have actually been a number of papers, but I'm thinking of one that I was just looking at by Jonathan Doe and Jean Baudouin, who's in Global Strategy Journal, talking about partnerships among multinationals and NGOs to provide services that would in developed countries be applied by or supplied by government, but in less developed areas that the combination of NGOs and multinationals were indeed filling some of these voids. So there's been some stuff written on that. I think that, and in John's particular question, you know, if you look at, say, the global automotive industry, I mean, car companies look like they're going to cram electric vehicles down the throats of the public, whether we want it, and I would say I'm in favor of that, or not, and not everybody is. But you know, governments have made stabs in this direction, but I think what it appears is going to happen is that we're going to face in the next 20 years an environment where most automobiles or other transportation vehicles are going to be powered by electricity, because the public to some extent demands it, and because there seems to be just a industry-wide decision to move in this direction. I expect that what we'll see is governments backfilling and creating regulation to support this. So I would say multinationals can do this, but at the same time, I think we need to remember, and the NGOs are going to have to remember as they come into it, that the companies are still going to have to find a way to profit. And again, I think the automotive companies think the way to profit for them is going to be to move in this electric vehicle direction, and that the social benefit to the environment is going to be, for them, a side effect.
I think just to piggyback on what Steve said, I've been doing a lot of work on renewable energy for the last 15 years or so, wind turbines, solar panels, and so on and so forth. And one of the things we find is that I mean, two realities. First of all, firms are more of the solution than the problem. I mean, firms definitely are. A lot of the innovation in these areas come from firms. The second reality is that it is actually emerging markets, China and India, which are actually the site of a lot of installation, creation, innovation within these renewable energy sectors. And so the notion that which I mean that people tend to have, that all these advanced things come from Germany and Scandinavia and so on, it's just not true. I mean the vast majority of installation and creation of renewable energy models is actually happening in emerging markets. In the automotive sector, as Steve correctly pointed out, the largest single market, as all of us know, for EVs is in fact China. India is following very rapidly that direction, and so on. So I think that very often, and this is I think an unfortunate thing, even business academics tend to have this view that the leaders of multinational companies are entirely driven by the next quarter. And there may be some CEOs that are driven that way, but I think it behooves us to remember that these companies are controlled and managed by extremely intelligent individuals that recognize the global problems that we are within, and are trying to work for the same objectives. Climate change issues, sustainability issues that all of us consider important.
So I would say that indeed global companies have a role to play, no matter what their motivation is. So their motivation can partly be moral, or it can be driven by stakeholder requirements or demands. But in the end, I think many of them will start playing a role. And of course, it's interesting for us to also analyze whether, to some extent, their activities are, genuine or what you want to call it, or whether they are just a green curtain. But in the end, I think they have a role to play. I think they cooperate with NGOs for that, starting to learn to do that, but also with government. And a second point I wanted to make is that it's not just in emerging markets that there are voids in this regard, right? I think in many of our Western countries, governments don't do enough. I mean, in the Netherlands where I live, there's a lot of comments on the government not achieving the aims that they have promised. And we've also seen court rules, for example, well, not so recent, I think it was a year ago, against Shell, Royal Shell, that they have to decrease their global environmental footprint, right? So there are other players coming in and forcing and pressuring global companies to play a role in solving these challenges, and indeed, therefore playing their role in helping societies or helping governments to achieve their aims.
Yes, Alvaro, please.
Thank you. Going back to your point on the SDGs, I think they have made an impact, mostly because they have brought attention to the issues. And now everybody wants to adopt some of the logos and they place them on their websites. And it started the conversation. I think it's doing very good. It's having a lot of impact on what we are thinking about. However, at the end of the day, and this I think is important, it's not just the multinationals, but all the companies that have a role. And I think it is us as consumers, the ones that I think are going to drive most of the change. Yes, multinationals will have lots of, if you want, incentives to behave well. But if consumers don't care about it and they are not willing to pay more or to choose the products that are more, if you want, sustainable, and we are going to have a limitation there. And also, there is also the story of the government. The problems we have now are issues of global commons and externalities. That requires coordination, and that's driven mostly going to be by governments, regulation, and it's not just the local government, but also coordination among governments across all the countries. So yes, it's kind of, if you want, a story of the grand challenges. And the good thing is that, yes, we're making a change and multinationals are making changes, but I also think that consumers especially and governments have to play a big role in creating the incentives towards this change.
Yes, right.
If I may.
Yes.
Yep. Just picking on what Alvaro and Ram and Rian have already started on. This is a sort of a challenging and messy area. We're really sort of into the realities of the second best, at best, the second best. And I think a case in point here is working towards a more circular type of economy. And obviously, we would get real traction if we were able to sort of sort out the issues in achieving circularity, closing the loop, so to speak, on the global level. And multinationals would be crucially important in this, because they are the orchestrators of the economic system currently. The problem is that most solutions that are related, for example, to circularity, many other sustainability issues too. The real life solutions to those issues are found at the local level, and I think this is aligned with what Alvaro said, that there's a disconnect here between sort of the type of solutions that we would like to see and what we can actually achieve, because the practical solutions are found locally, the challenges are global, and there is no simple way of coordinating across these levels. Perhaps multinationals, I think, may play a particularly important role when solutions can be found at a more regional level, where they are able to work with a limited number of political actors and consumers, at the same time as their actual sort of control and coordination reach is still effective. And globally, that's seldom the case, but regionally it could be.
Thank you, Gabriel. Ram, please.
I would like to connect what Alvaro said to a question I see from Edith in the chat about new methodological approaches. I mean, Alvaro made an excellent point that ultimately, though CEOs and top management teams may be highly intelligent and very positively motivated to act the right way, ultimately, if consumers don't care, there's going to be a powerful temptation to just give customers what they want. Customers say, "Well, I want something cheaper. I don't care what the hell how it comes here." Then there's going to be a temptation to provide that. Now, the question is, do we know what new methodological approaches do you think we need to move global strategy research forward? And I think one thing that I think is very underutilized in the global strategy at this point, in terms of data, in terms of mining data, in terms of utilizing it, especially in the context of all of my distinguished colleagues talked about the behavioral aspects, which are so important, is a revolution that's happened in the last 15 years, which is social media. Now, social media offers a tremendous, we know, a tremendous pathway towards forming consumer preferences and guiding customer preferences in particular directions. I mean, it used to be the case in the 20th century, it was all advertising, right? From me to you kind of thing. Increasingly, what we're seeing, of course, is that with social media, it's a two-way street. One of the things I think that I encourage young scholars to look at, I mean, the MIS field is far ahead of us in this area, is the fact that I've got a colleague who's doing some work here in MIS, actually looking at corporate sophistication, the utilization of social media. Okay, now in other words, companies like Boeing and Lockheed and IBM and so on, how sophisticated are they in terms of utilizing social media? And these companies, they're multi-billion-dollar companies, and it's incredible how unsophisticated they are. In fact, many of them have no social media strategy at all. I mean, you have these companies which are so smart in terms of innovation and patents and R&D and all things they do, and they have no concept of how to deal with approaching an 18-year-old. Basically, the 18-year-olds don't care about your bloody advertising. What they care about is what they see on Snapchat. And these guys have no Snapchat strategy. In fact, of the Fortune 500 companies, 382 CEOs don't have a social media profile. They don't have one. Okay, so basically, you're a CEO and you're zero presence on social media. So this is a clear opportunity. I mean, you have an opportunity to influence customers. I mean, there are some exceptions, like Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk is tremendously sophisticated in his utilization of social media. And he moves a lot of the reason why people like EVs. Why do young people like EVs? Well, because Elon Musk is approaching them and saying, listen, buy a Tesla, right? So and single-handedly, he's moving preferences, the meter, in terms of EV adoption. EVs are cool. I want EVs, right? But this is something a company is not doing. So I'll stop here.
I see many questions in the chat, but given our setup and the time restriction, I would encourage people to reach out to the panelists with those specific questions.